The morning it happened, 200,000 people had stopped breathing at once. It was the 10,000th year festival of a civilization that had built its calendar on the reliability of a single sun. The world is called Saurin. 3 suns share its sky. 2 are wild, a close pair the people call the Storm Sisters. They flare, they smoke, they drive the weather. The 3rd is called Tikar. It means, roughly, the still one. For 10,000 years, Tikar had done nothing surprising. It rose on time. It set on time. Its light was cool and clean. So they built a religion on how still it was. The festival was timed to the exact second. The moment Tikar's noon shadow would fall on the founding stone where their first priestess had stood 10 millennia earlier, 200,000 people had gathered in the northern capital to see it. Almost 1 billion more were watching by broadcast. At the predicted second, Tikar dimmed. It did not go out. It fell to 1/10 of its usual brightness, a soft wrong dusk in the middle of a bright morning, and it stayed there for 47 seconds before recovering as smoothly as it had failed. They called this event the Taret, the stumble. It was the first time in 10,000 years of recorded observation that the sky had ever contradicted them. To understand what the stumble did to them, you have to understand what they had built on the fact that it had never happened before. The people of Saurin are a mature planetary civilization. Roughly 2 billion of them across 3 continents, fission power, radio, orbital telescopes, a long history of patient observatory science. They are humanoid, slight, long-limbed, with skin like pale porcelain. Their eyes carry 3 separate focal channels, one tuned to each of their suns. In the most literal sense, their biology is evolved to read the sky. Their theology reads the sky too. Their founding text sorts the 3 suns into 2 moral categories. The Storm Sisters are the mother fear, temperamental, seasonal, flare-prone, propitiated but never trusted. The steady sun is the father provision, reliable, predictable, worshipped as the reliable one. There is no creation myth, no gods with faces, only the sky as it is, a doctrine about how to live under it, and a calendar predicting Tikar's every position for the next 10,000 years. The calendar has never been wrong. Their whole civil life runs on it. Their contracts, their planting seasons, their legal identities. A citizen's legal name is a 3-part compound recording the exact positions of the 3 suns at the moment of their birth. To be a person on Saurin is to carry, in your own name, the fingerprint of the promise their sun has kept for 10,000 years. So when that promise broke for 47 seconds, what broke was not just an astronomical prediction. It was the moral foundation of an entire world. The strange thing, the thing they only slowly began to admit to themselves, was that they had known something was wrong about Tikar for 400 years, and done nothing. The knowledge was in every child's schoolbook. It had been hiding in plain sight under a very respectable name. 400 years earlier, their civilization had had its own Newton, a mathematician of the astronomer priesthood whose job was to work out the orbital mechanics of the three-body system. He hit a problem. The equations would not balance. Assuming Tekar had the mass of an ordinary sun, the whole system should have collapsed into itself in a matter of years. Assuming Tekar had no mass at all, none, zero, the equations came out clean. So Modan did what generations of scientists on Earth have done in similar situations. He wrote a constant into the math. He gave it a small, boring symbol and a small, boring name, the Modan constant. He did not explain what it was. He only demonstrated that the equations worked if you included it, and included it always. The paper was quietly admitted to orthodoxy. The constant was taught to every 8-year-old for the next 300 years. Nobody asked what it meant. The horror of the thing is that in their textbooks it looked exactly as boring as any other useful number. 44 years after Modan, a younger astronomer said the quiet part aloud. In a short paper, he argued that the Modan constant was not physically meaningful, that it was a patch for a real, unnamed anomaly. He was excommunicated within 2 months, tried for civic apostasy, executed. His paper was locked in a vault. His name was struck from the civil register. For 4,000 years, a small order of archivist heretics quietly maintained the vault. They reread that one paper 5 separate times across the centuries, and each time they decided that publishing it would end their order, and re-shelved it. Then, 20 years before the stumble, a chaos mathematician proved a much larger and much colder thing. She proved that no three-body gravitational system, in any configuration, could be indefinitely stable. Saurin contradicted her theorem simply by existing, and in a lecture theatre in the northern capital, she asked the obvious question out loud. Either the mathematics is wrong, or the sky is. Within a decade, the archivist heretics unlocked the vault. The old paper came into print for the first time in 4,000 years, and a whole civilization looked all at once at the small, respectable number in the corner of every textbook they owned. The first thing the astronomers did, once they were allowed to look, was to measure the light itself. An ordinary star has a fingerprint. Its light carries dark absorption lines, hydrogen at these frequencies, sodium at those, iron at those. A star's spectrum is a chemical signature written by the star's own body. Tekar had no fingerprint. A spectroscopist had noticed this 40 years earlier and filed a routine paper. At the time, it was catalogued as a curiosity. The Modan constant absorbed it, the way it absorbed everything. Now, cross-referenced against the old vault paper and the chaos theorem, the finding read differently. A sun with no fingerprint is a sun with no atmosphere. A sun with no atmosphere is not a sun. The second thing they did was measure how far away it was. 3 observatories, spanning 3 continents, took the same measurement on the same night. The answer came back moon-sized, at the distance of an inner planet. Not stellar scale, not stellar distant, moon scale and close. At that point, everyone knew, without anyone quite saying it, that the steady sun was a manufactured object. But they were still at that stage, hoping it was a lamp. A lantern hung in the sky by someone, for some reason, that just happened to keep them warm. That was the last comforting version of the story. It lasted about a month. The dynamics team put Tikar back into their equations of the Storm Sisters' orbit, this time as a variable rather than a fixed god. Remove the third body from the model altogether, and the Storm Sisters became a decaying binary. They were already spiraling toward each other. Left alone, they would have merged in a runaway violet gamma cataclysm some 200 million years ago. Reinsert a moon-scale object at Tikar's position, but assume it is radiating momentum, pushing on the Storm Sisters with a continuous beam of directed mass, and the orbit stabilizes. The two sisters stop spiraling. Their period settles. They start, in the model, to behave exactly the way the people of Saurin have watched them behave for 10,000 years, which meant Tikar was not a lamp at all. Tikar was a machine holding two collapsing stars apart. Its primary function was mechanical. Two collimated streams of directed mass, aimed continuously at the Storm Sisters. The daylight that had bathed their world for 10,000 years was not the machine's output. It was the machine's exhaust. The clean narrow-band light was scattered spill from the work beam and radiator heat from cooling shells. Every citizen of Saurin had spent their whole life sunbathing in the sparks of a welding torch. The astronomers had to admit that the object needed a second name. They kept Tikar for the disk as their ancestors had known it, the ceremonial name, the one still stitched into every child's birth chart. They gave the machine itself a new name, Oranu, the lamp that worked. The reveal that broke the theology was not that Tikar was a machine. They had, by then, more or less prepared themselves for that. The reveal that broke the theology was how old it was. The dating came out of the geology and the debris band at the same time. Every deep cross-section on every continent contained a fine ochre cream layer, laid down at regular intervals for as far back as the rock went. Paleontologists had used it as a stratigraphic clock for 2,000 years, without knowing what set the clock. Once someone thought to compare its interval to Oranu's orbital resonance with Saurin, the answer landed like a stone. The layer was the machine's ash, deposited every time Saurin passed through the residual dust of the work beam. The layer went back 200 million years, through every fossil bed they had ever excavated, through the appearance of their vertebrate ancestors, through the fossil origin of their own three-lobed eyes, which had evolved to read the machine's narrow-band light, because the machine was already there when the ancestors first opened their eyes and looked up. The machine predated the biosphere. 200 million years ago, someone had switched it on. There had been no one on Saurin to switch it on for. At the same time, the astronomers who studied the faint debris band low along the night sky, the Valira, the river of ash, an object their poets had celebrated for millennia as decoration, matched its mineral composition to a shattered rocky planet. There was no biosignature in it. There was no writing on it. There was only the composition of a world that had once existed and no longer did. The Valira was a gravestone, and the machine had been built by the people buried in it to save the world that was now the gravestone. They had failed. Their planet had come apart anyway, some time before the machine started running. And the machine, faithful and dumb, and not knowing anyone else had ever been listening, had kept holding the Storm Sisters apart for 200 million years. The other thing they derived from the turret's shape was a fuel curve. The stutter was a warning transient, the signature of an aging fusion core touching reserve. The machine had approximately 140 years of continuous operation left. When it stopped, roughly a third of Saurine's plants, the ones that had evolved a third leaf lobe, tuned to the machine's narrowband spill, would die inside one growing season. Everything they had ever called mercy was, they now understood, a tolerance band. It had been running out on a schedule for 200 million years. It happened to run out on their watch. There was a version of this story in which they collapsed into a doomsday cult. That is not what they did. The astronomer priesthood, the same one that had spent 4,000 years enforcing the Modan constant as orthodoxy, reorganized itself into an engineering cause. They gave themselves a new name, and they inherited, without needing to be told, a purpose that had been implicit in their liturgy all along. The liturgy had never actually been prayer. It had been the reading aloud, in every observatory, of the machine's predicted position at every hour of every day for 10,000 years. It had been, without anyone knowing it, a maintenance log. Now, the same priesthood picked up its own log and read it forward as an operations manual. The Southern Engineering Guilds did the hard, technical work. Their engines were only barely adequate. Their orbital mechanics were only barely adequate. Their doctrine, though, was almost exactly right. And they went up on it. The first crewed expedition rose from the southern basin 12 years after the stumble. They found a slot in the outer shell that was the exact shape and size of a service door. Etched into its inner wall was a single line of writing in an alphabet nobody on Saurin had ever seen before. The linguistic archivists worked on it for 40 years, and then, satisfied, released their translation. The translation was 3 sentences long. The builders of the machine, whose broken world was the river of ash, had left a message for whoever eventually made it up to the seam. It said, "It was never meant to run this long. We left it on. Learn quickly."